At the top floor of a corporate tower, a ruthless director humiliates his team without imagining who is about to challenge him. Suddenly, a little girl bursts into the room and shouts firmly, "Don't yell at my mom!" In front of everyone, she yanks the tie of the most feared man in the company, and no one dares to breathe. The video of the moment goes viral, but what no one expected was his reaction. Something inside that man begins to change forever. The 42nd floor of Sterling Industries buzzed with nervous tension as David Sterling paced behind his massive mahogany desk. His voice cut through the Chicago skyline view like a blade, each word designed to wound the marketing team standing before him. Margaret Thompson moved silently along the perimeter of the conference room, her cleaning cart wheels muffled against the plush carpet. She had perfected the art of invisibility during her 3 years working the executive floors, understanding that acknowledgement could mean trouble. "This campaign is pathetic," David's voice rose, causing Margaret to pause near the window. "My grandmother could have designed better marketing materials with her eyes closed. Johnson, your team has exactly 48 hours to completely overhaul this disaster, or you'll find yourselves cleaning offices instead of occupying them." Margaret winced at his words, knowing how hard the custodial staff worked to keep this building pristine. She continued her methodical cleaning, hoping to finish before the storm brewing in David's office reached its peak. The marketing team exchanged desperate glances, their faces pale under the harsh fluorescent lighting. "And another thing," David continued, his 6-foot frame casting an imposing shadow across the room. "If I see one more half-hearted presentation cross my desk, there will be consequences. This company didn't become Chicago's premier real estate development firm by accepting mediocrity." The conference room door suddenly burst open, with the kind of enthusiasm only a 5-year-old could muster. Emma Thompson, Margaret's daughter, bounded into the room wearing her favorite purple dress and carrying a stuffed elephant. Margaret's heart stopped as she watched her daughter scan the room with curious brown eyes, completely oblivious to the tension she had just shattered. "Mommy," Emma called out, spotting Margaret near the windows. "I got bored waiting in the lobby and the nice security man said you were up here cleaning." Every face in the room turned toward the small intruder, but Emma's attention had already shifted to David Sterling, who stood frozen behind his desk. Her expression changed from cheerful to disapproving as she studied his stern face and hostile posture. "Why are you being mean to these people?" Emma asked, her small voice carrying clearly through the silence. She walked directly toward David, her elephant dragging behind her on the carpet. David blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "My mommy taught me that when people work hard, you're supposed to say thank you, not be mean," Emma continued, now standing directly in front of the most powerful man in the building. "You're being a bully, and that's not nice." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. She moved quickly toward her daughter, but Emma was already reaching up toward David's perfectly knotted silk tie. "Emma, no!" Margaret whispered urgently. But it was too late. With the swift determination that only children possess, Emma grabbed David's navy blue tie and gave it a firm tug, pulling the tall CEO down to her eye level. "There," she announced proudly. "Now you can look at me when I'm talking to you. My mommy says it's rude not to look at people." The room erupted in barely contained gasps. Margaret watched in horror as her daughter released David's tie and crossed her small arms, waiting for his response. The marketing team stood frozen, unsure whether to flee or stay to witness what would surely be an unprecedented corporate meltdown. David Sterling slowly straightened his tie, his face unreadable. For several long moments, he simply stared at the fearless child before him. Then, something Margaret had never seen happened. The corner of his mouth twitched upward in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "You think I'm being mean?" he asked Emma, his voice notably softer. "Very mean," Emma confirmed with a serious nod. "These people look scared, and scary grown-ups are bullies. Are you a bully, mister?" Margaret finally reached her daughter and gently took her hand. "Emma, sweetie, we need to go, right now." "But, Mommy, he didn't answer my question," Emma protested, looking between her mother and David. David crouched down to Emma's level, bringing his face inches from hers. "What's your name?" "Emma Elizabeth Thompson," she replied proudly. "What's yours?" "David," he said simply. And Emma, you might be the first person in this building brave enough to tell me the truth. He stood and looked around the room at his employees, who were still watching the scene with a mixture of amazement and terror. Meeting adjourned, he announced. Johnson, we'll continue this discussion tomorrow. As the marketing team filed out quickly, Margaret gathered her cleaning supplies with shaking hands. This was it. She would lose her job, the health insurance Emma needed for her asthma medication, the steady income that kept their tiny apartment in Pilsen affordable. Everything she had worked for would disappear because her 5-year-old daughter had confronted the CEO. Mrs. Thompson. David's voice stopped her at the door. Margaret turned slowly, holding Emma's hand tightly. Yes, Mr. Sterling. Could I speak with you for a moment? Emma can wait in my assistant's office. Sarah has some coloring books there. Margaret nodded numbly, her mind racing through possible explanations and apologies. She watched as David's assistant, a kind woman named Sarah, led Emma to a comfortable chair beside her desk, providing her with paper and crayons. Please, sit down, David said once they were alone in his office. Margaret perched on the edge of the leather chair across from his desk, her uniform feeling suddenly shabby against the expensive furnishings. David sat behind his desk, but leaned forward, his usual intimidating demeanor replaced by something she couldn't quite identify. How long have you worked here? He asked. 3 years, Mr. Sterling, Margaret replied quietly. I've never had any complaints about my work, and I promise this won't happen again. Emma usually stays at the community center after school, but they had to close early today because of a water pipe issue. That's not why I asked, David said, studying her face. In 3 years, have I ever acknowledged you? Spoken to you? Even looked at you? Margaret shifted uncomfortably. Sir, I understand that executives have important responsibilities. I don't expect... That wasn't an answer, David interrupted gently. Have I? No, sir, Margaret admitted. David was quiet for several moments, tapping his pen against the desk. Your daughter is remarkable, fearless. Where did she learn to stand up to people like that? Margaret felt a spark of pride cut through her anxiety. Emma has always been strong-willed. Her father, well, I've raised her alone since she was 2. I've tried to teach her to speak up for what's right, though maybe I should. Have included some lessons about appropriate times and places. Don't, David said quickly. Don't apologize for raising a child who sees injustice and acts on it. That's rare. Margaret stared at him, confused by the direction of the conversation. This wasn't the termination meeting she had expected. Mrs. Thompson, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. When you clean these offices, when you hear the way I speak to people, what do you think? Margaret's throat felt dry. Mr. Sterling, I really don't think my opinion... Your daughter just pulled my tie and called me a bully in front of my marketing team, David said with a slight smile. I think we're past formalities. Margaret looked toward the door where Emma was contentedly coloring, her elephant sitting guard beside her chair. Taking a deep breath, she made a decision that would change everything. I think you're brilliant at business, she said carefully, but I think you've forgotten that the people working for you are human beings with families and fears and dreams. I think success has isolated you, and maybe you don't realize how your words affect people anymore. David leaned back in his chair, processing her words. And what do you think I should do about that? I think, Margaret said, surprised by her own boldness, that maybe you should try seeing your employees the way Emma saw you today. Not as positions on an organizational chart, but as people who deserve basic respect and kindness. For the first time in Margaret's memory, David Sterling was completely silent. He stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago, his hands clasped behind his back. 20 years, he said finally. 20 years I've built this company, and a 5-year-old girl teaches me something. To no MBA program ever did. He turned back to Margaret. I want you to know that Emma won't face any consequences for today. Neither will you. In fact, I'd like to make sure she has proper after-school care, so situations like this don't arise again. Margaret's eyes widened. Sir, that's very generous, but I can't accept... It's not charity, David said firmly. It's an investment in keeping valuable employees comfortable and productive. You do excellent work, Mrs. Thompson. I should have noticed that before today." As Margaret gathered Emma and prepared to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in the building's atmosphere. David Sterling had not only listened to her 5-year-old daughter, but had seemed genuinely affected by the encounter. "Mommy," Emma said as they walked toward the elevator, "why did that man look so sad when he was being mean?" Margaret glanced back toward David's office, where she could see his silhouette still standing by the windows. "I don't know, sweetheart. But maybe that's something worth thinking about." The next morning, Margaret arrived at work to find the entire custodial staff buzzing with excitement. Apparently, the security guard who had escorted Emma upstairs had recorded part of the encounter on his phone. The video of Emma confronting David Sterling was spreading through the building's informal communication networks faster than office gossip. "Did you see this?" her colleague Rosa Martinez whispered, showing Margaret her phone screen. "Little Emma pulling the boss man's tie like she's adjusting his attitude." Margaret watched the short clip with a mixture of pride and mortification. In the video, Emma looked impossibly small next to David's imposing figure, but her voice was clear and confident as she called him out for his behavior. "The whole building's talking about it," Rosa continued. "They're calling Emma the little CEO whisperer. Some of the guys from accounting made memes already." Throughout the morning, Margaret noticed something different in the building's atmosphere. Employees who usually hurried past with downcast eyes were smiling and whispering about the brave little girl who had said what they all wished they could say. The video had given voice to years of accumulated frustration and fear. But Margaret also noticed something else. David Sterling had emerged from his office 3 times that morning, something that rarely happened. Each time, his eyes seemed to search the corridors, and when he passed, Margaret in the hallway, he nodded politely and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson." By lunchtime, Margaret realized that David's behavior toward other employees had also shifted noticeably. His voice in meetings carried less venom, his criticism came wrapped in constructive suggestions, and he had actually thanked his assistant for her help with scheduling. "It's like watching someone wake up from a long sleep," Sarah confided to Margaret during their lunch break. "He asked me about my weekend plans. In 4 years of working for him, he's never asked me anything personal." Margaret found herself thinking about David Sterling more than she cared to admit. There had been something vulnerable in his eyes during their conversation, something that suggested Emma had touched a part of him that had been buried under years of corporate ruthlessness. 3 days later, Margaret was cleaning the executive break room when David appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Thompson, could I speak with you for a moment?" Margaret nodded, setting down her cleaning supplies. David looked different somehow, less imposing in his perfectly tailored suit. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he said, leaning against the counter rather than towering over her. "About seeing people as human beings rather than just employees. I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to help me with something." "Of course, Mr. Sterling. I'd like to have lunch with you," he said, and Margaret's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Not a romantic gesture," he added quickly, "but an opportunity to learn. You see this company from a perspective I've never had. You interact with employees from every department. You understand their concerns and frustrations. I think you could teach me things that no board meeting ever could." Margaret stared at him, processing the unprecedented request. "You want management advice from the cleaning lady?" "I want human advice from someone who sees clearly," David corrected. "Emma opened my eyes, but you could help me understand what I'm looking at." Against her better judgment, Margaret found herself agreeing. "All right, Mr. Sterling, but I have conditions." David raised an eyebrow. "Name them." "We eat in the employee cafeteria, not some fancy restaurant. And you listen to people, really listen, without judging or planning your responses. Can you do that?" For the first time since Emma had pulled his tie, David Sterling smiled genuinely. "I can try, Mrs. Thompson. I can definitely try." As Margaret watched him walk away, she wondered what she had just agreed to. More importantly, she wondered why the thought of spending time with David Sterling made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with professional anxiety. Emma had started something with her innocent confrontation, but Margaret had the distinct feeling that whatever was beginning was far from over. The employee cafeteria had never hosted a more unlikely lunch pairing. David Sterling sat across from Margaret Thompson at a simple plastic table, his expensive suit looking oddly out of place among the maintenance workers and junior staff. Margaret watched nervously as David tried to navigate his first conversation with building employees as an actual human being, rather than their intimidating boss. "Mr. Sterling," called out James Rodriguez from the loading dock, approaching their table with obvious hesitation. "I just wanted to say thanks for approving the new safety equipment we requested. We've been asking for those harnesses for 2 years. David looked genuinely surprised. 2 years? Why wasn't I told it had been pending that long? Well, sir, requests like that usually get filtered through 3 different departments before reaching your desk, James explained. By the time they get to you. If they get to you, they've been reduced to budget line items without context. Margaret watched David absorb this information, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. What else has been lost in translation, James? Over the next hour, Margaret witnessed something remarkable. David listened as employees shared concerns about outdated equipment, scheduling conflicts that affected their families, and small improvements that could make their jobs safer and more efficient. With each conversation, she saw him becoming more human, more connected to the reality of the people who kept his company running. "This is eye-opening," David admitted to Margaret as they walked back toward the elevators. "I've been managing numbers and reports instead of people. How did I become so disconnected?" "Success can be isolating," Margaret replied gently. "When you're always the person making final decisions, it's easy to forget that those decisions affect real lives." Over the following weeks, their lunch meetings became a regular occurrence. David would seek Margaret's perspective on employee concerns, and she found herself looking forward to their conversations. He began implementing changes based on their discussions, improved safety protocols, more flexible scheduling for parents, and regular town halls where employees could voice concerns directly. But Margaret also noticed other changes in David that had nothing to do with management strategy. He started bringing Emma small gifts when he encountered them in the building: a book about elephants, crayons for her artwork, healthy snacks for after school. He remembered details about Margaret's life, asking about Emma's school projects and her struggles with asthma. "Mommy," Emma said one afternoon as they walked to the bus stop, "I think Mr. David likes you." Margaret felt her cheeks warm. "What makes you say that, sweetheart?" "He smiles different when he looks at you," Emma observed with the startling perceptiveness of children. "Like how Prince Eric looked at Ariel in the movie." Margaret couldn't deny that she had noticed it too. The way David's stern expression softened when he saw her, how his business voice became gentler during their conversations, the way he found excuses to walk past areas where she worked. More troubling was her own growing awareness of him, how his laugh sounded when something genuinely amused him, the way he rolled up his sleeves when he was thinking hard about a problem, the kindness in his eyes when he interacted with Emma. But not everyone viewed the developing relationship positively. Marcus Webb, one of Margaret's longtime colleagues in the custodial department, began making pointed comments about her special treatment. "Must be nice having the boss wrapped around your finger," he muttered while they restocked supplies. "Some of us have been working here longer and never got personal lunch invitations." "It's not like that, Marcus," Margaret protested. "He's just trying to understand employee perspectives better." "Right," Marcus scoffed. "And I'm sure those perspective sessions have nothing to do with you being a single mother with a cute kid and him being a lonely rich guy." His words stung because they echoed Margaret's own insecurities. Was David's interest in her genuine, or was she just a project, a way for him to feel better about himself? The situation became more complicated when Victoria Ashworth, David's former fiancée from his social circle, returned to Chicago after 3 years in London. Victoria was everything Margaret wasn't: polished, educated at prestigious schools, connected to Chicago's old money families. When she appeared at Sterling Industries one Thursday afternoon demanding to see David, Margaret watched through the glass walls of his office as the elegant blonde made herself comfortable in the chair where Margaret usually sat. "Did you see her?" Rosa whispered as Margaret cleaned nearby offices. That's Victoria Ashworth. Her family owns half of the Gold Coast. Word is they were supposed to get married before she moved to Europe. Margaret's heart sank as she observed their animated conversation. Victoria's laughter carried through the office, and Margaret noticed how easily she touched David's arm, how comfortable they seemed together. When David walked Victoria to the elevator, his hand resting lightly on her back, Margaret felt a crushing realization. She and David existed in completely different worlds, and she had been foolish to think otherwise. That evening, Margaret's world tilted further when she found an eviction notice taped to her apartment door. Her landlord was selling the building to developers who planned to demolish it for luxury condominiums. She had 30 days to find new housing in a city where rent prices were skyrocketing. "Mommy, why are you crying?" Emma asked, finding Margaret sitting at their small kitchen table with the notice in her hands. "Just some grown-up problems, sweetheart," Margaret managed, wiping her eyes. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Emma, with her uncanny ability to sense when things were wrong, crawled into Margaret's lap. "Is it about our house?" Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. How could she explain to a 5-year-old that they might have to leave the only home Emma remembered, possibly move to a different neighborhood where Margaret couldn't afford the rent, maybe even leave Chicago entirely? The next day, David immediately noticed Margaret's distress. "What's wrong?" he asked during their lunch meeting, his concern evident. "Nothing I can't handle," Margaret replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "Margaret, talk to me. What's happened?" Despite her intention to keep her personal problems separate, the whole story tumbled out. The eviction notice, her frantic search for affordable housing, her fear of disrupting Emma's schooling and medical care. David listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "Let me help," he said immediately. "I can connect you with some good apartments or provide a loan for a deposit." "No," Margaret said firmly. "I can't accept that kind of help from you." "Why not?" David's frustration was apparent. "I have resources. You have a problem I can solve." It seemed straightforward. Margaret struggled to articulate her feelings. "Because it changes things between us. Because I don't want to wonder if your interest in me is about pity or charity. Because I need to be able to take care of my daughter myself." David sat back, clearly hurt by her rejection. "Is that really what you think of me? That I would manipulate you when you're vulnerable?" "I don't know what to think," Margaret admitted. "Yesterday, I saw you with Victoria Ashworth. You looked comfortable together, natural, like you belonged in the same world." Understanding dawned on David's face. "Margaret, Victoria is my past. A past I'm not interested in, returning to. She came to discuss some family business obligations, nothing more." "Family business obligations that include marriage contracts?" Margaret asked, surprising herself with her directness. David's silence told her everything she needed to know. Victoria's return wasn't just social. There were legal and financial entanglements from their former engagement that complicated David's life. "It's complicated," David finally said, "but it doesn't change how I feel about you." "How do you feel about me, David?" Margaret asked quietly. Before he could answer, his assistant appeared at their table, looking flustered. "Mr. Sterling, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Emma's school called. There's been an incident." Margaret's world stopped. "What kind of incident?" "She had an allergic reaction during lunch. They're taking her to Northwestern Memorial Hospital." Margaret stood so quickly her chair toppled backward. David was beside her immediately, his hand on her arm. "I'll drive you," he said without hesitation. "You don't need to." "Margaret, I'm driving you to the hospital. Don't argue." The 20-minute drive felt like hours. Margaret sat rigidly in David's Mercedes, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. David navigated Chicago traffic with focused intensity, occasionally reaching over to squeeze her hand. "She's strong," he said quietly. "She's going to be fine." At the hospital, Margaret rushed to the pediatric emergency department while David dealt with parking. By the time he found her, Margaret was pacing the waiting room, tears streaming down her face. "They won't let me see her yet," she said when David approached. "They're still working on her. The school thinks she ate something with nuts in it, but she's usually so careful." David didn't say anything. He simply pulled Margaret into his arms and held her as she cried against his chest. In that moment, she didn't care about their different social classes or complicated pasts. She just needed someone to be strong when she felt like falling apart. They sat together in the waiting room for 3 hours. David made phone calls to ensure Margaret wouldn't lose pay for missing work, brought her coffee she didn't drink, and sat quietly holding her hand. He didn't try to fix the situation or minimize her fears. He simply stayed. When the doctor finally emerged, Margaret jumped to her feet. "How is she?" "She's stable," the pediatrician assured her. "It was a severe allergic reaction, but we caught it in time. She's going to be fine, but we want to monitor her overnight." Margaret's knees nearly buckled with relief. David's arm around her waist kept her upright as they were led to Emma's room. Emma looked tiny in the hospital bed, an IV in her small arm and oxygen tubes in her nose. But her eyes were bright when she saw Margaret. "Mummy, the doctors said I can't eat cookies anymore unless you check them first." Margaret laughed through her tears, kissing Emma's forehead. "That's right, baby. We have to be extra careful." "Hi, Mr. David," Emma said, noticing David standing quietly by the door. "Did you come to visit me too?" David approached the bed, his usual composure cracking slightly. "I wanted to make sure you were okay, Emma. You scared us." "I scared myself too," Emma admitted. "But the doctors here are really nice. One of them showed me pictures of her daughter who's in my grade at a different school." As visiting hours ended, David prepared to leave. "I'll check on you tomorrow," he told Margaret. "David, wait," Margaret called out as he reached the door. "Thank you for driving me, for staying, for—" She gestured helplessly, unable to find words for everything he had done. "You don't need to thank me," David said softly. "I care about you, Margaret. Both of you. More than I probably should. More than makes sense given our circumstances. But I do." After he left, Emma studied her mother with serious 5-year-old eyes. "Mommy, Mr. David loves you." "What makes you think that, sweetheart?" "He stayed here all day, even though he didn't have to. And he looked really scared when I was sick. People only get that scared about people they love." Margaret felt her heart racing. "And how would you feel about that if Mr. David loved us?" Emma considered this carefully. "I think it would be nice. He makes you smile and he's learning not to be mean to people. Plus, he brought me that elephant book, so he's pretty okay." That night, alone in the hospital room with her sleeping daughter, Margaret faced the truth she had been avoiding. She was falling in love with David Sterling, despite every rational reason why it was a terrible idea. He had shown her kindness, respect, and genuine care. He had changed not just his behavior but his entire approach to life, partly because of Emma's courage and partly because he wanted to be worthy of Margaret's respect. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Victoria Ashworth appeared in the hospital room doorway, impeccably dressed and clearly uncomfortable in the sterile environment. "I hope I'm not intruding," Victoria said coolly. "I wanted to speak with you about David." Margaret tensed, glancing at Emma, who was coloring in a new book David had brought that morning. "David and I have a complicated history," Victoria continued. "Our families have been connected for generations. There are business arrangements, social expectations, financial entanglements that can't simply be wished away." "What are you trying to tell me?" Margaret asked. "I'm trying to tell you that David's infatuation with you is charming but temporary. Men like him don't end up with women like you. They may play at being reformed, but eventually they return to their own kind." Margaret felt anger rise in her chest. "Is that a threat?" "It's a reality check," Victoria replied. "David will tire of this experiment in social consciousness. When he does, you'll be left with a broken heart and a child who's become attached to something she can't have." After Victoria left, Margaret sat staring out the hospital window. Doubt crept in despite her feelings for David. Was she being naive? Was she setting herself and Emma up for heartbreak? When David arrived that afternoon, Margaret was distant and guarded. He noticed immediately. "What's wrong? Is Emma okay?" "Emma's fine. Victoria came to see me this morning." David's expression hardened. "What did she say?" "That you and she have complicated entanglements that won't just disappear. That men like you don't end up with women like me." David was quiet for a long moment. She's right about one thing. Victoria and I do have complicated legal and financial connections. Our families signed agreements years ago that will take lawyers months to untangle. Margaret's heart sank. So she was right. About the complications, yes. About everything else, absolutely not. David stepped closer. Margaret, I need you to understand something. I don't care about social expectations or family pressure or financial arrangements. I care about you. I care about Emma. I want to build something real with you, regardless of what anyone else thinks. But can you, really? Can you walk away from your world for hours? David knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. I'm not walking away from my world. I'm expanding it to include yours. There's a difference. Emma, who had been pretending to color while listening to every word, suddenly spoke up. Are you going to be my new daddy, Mr. David? The question hung in the air between them. Margaret held her breath as David looked at Emma with an expression of pure tenderness. If your mommy will let me, he said quietly, I'd like very much to be your family. Emma beamed. Good, because I already told all the nurses you were my daddy anyway. Margaret laughed despite her tears. Emma. What? He acted like a daddy. He was worried and stayed here and brought me presents. That's what daddies do. David stood and faced Margaret. She's right. I do want to be her father. I want to be your husband. I want us to be a family. I know it won't be easy, and I know there will be challenges, but I also know that what I feel for you is real. Margaret looked into David's eyes and saw her future, complicated, uncertain, but filled with love. David, Mommy, Emma interrupted, just say yes. Mr. David makes you happy. And he's learning to be nicer to people, and he loves us. Plus, he's really rich, so we probably won't have to worry about finding a new apartment. Both adults burst into laughter at Emma's practical assessment of the situation. Yes, Margaret said, looking at David through happy tears. Yes to all of it. David kissed her then, gentle and sweet, while Emma cheered from her hospital bed. 6 months later, the Sterling Industries employee break room buzzed with excitement as news spread that David Sterling had proposed to Margaret Thompson in the same cafeteria where they had shared their first real conversation. The engagement ring was modest by his standards, chosen because Margaret had insisted on something practical and beautiful rather than ostentatious. Emma, now 6 and fully recovered from her allergic reaction, had appointed herself wedding planner and kept a notebook full of important details like flowers should be purple and Daddy David should wear his nice tie. When are you getting married? Rosa asked Margaret as they prepared for their shifts. When Emma decides we're ready, Margaret laughed. She's very particular about the planning process. David had indeed faced social pressure and family complications because of his choice to marry Margaret. Several business relationships had been strained. Victoria's family had threatened legal action over broken agreements, and society magazines had published unflattering speculation about his dramatic life change. He had handled each challenge with calm determination, making it clear that his priorities had fundamentally shifted. He restructured business arrangements, paid penalties for broken agreements, and publicly stated that his personal happiness was not subject to public opinion. The Sterling Industries building had become a different place under David's transformed leadership. Employee satisfaction surveys reached all-time highs, turnover dropped significantly, and productivity increased as workers felt valued and heard. It's amazing what happens when people feel respected, Margaret observed during one of their evening conversations. It's amazing what happens when someone teaches you to see clearly, David replied, pulling her close. Emma, now calling David Daddy David to everyone's delight, had become something of a celebrity in the building. Employees would stop to chat with her when Margaret brought her to work, and she had appointed herself the unofficial morale officer, offering suggestions for improvement with the same fearless honesty that had started everything. Daddy David, Emma announced one evening over dinner, I think it's time for you to marry Mommy now. David and Margaret exchanged amused glances. Oh, do you, and why is that? Because I'm ready to be a flower girl, and because you already act like you're married anyway, and because Mrs. Rodriguez in accounting said you should stop making everyone wait for the wedding." David laughed and reached across the table to take Margaret's hand. "Well, if Mrs. Rodriguez from accounting says so, who are we to argue?" He turned to Margaret with mock seriousness. "Margaret Thompson, will you marry me next month so Emma can be a flower girl and Mrs. Rodriguez can stop giving me advice about my personal life?" "Yes," Margaret replied, grinning, "but only because Emma has been very patient with our slow progress." Emma clapped her hands triumphantly. "Finally, I'll tell everyone at work tomorrow that the wedding is happening soon." As Margaret watched her daughter and the man she loved plan their future together, she marveled at how a 5-year-old's courage to pull a CEO's tie had transformed all their lives. Love had grown in the most unlikely circumstances, proving that sometimes the bravest act is simply telling the truth with an open heart.